Welcome to Train Signal. You are watching Exploring UCS Manager. In this lesson, we're going to take a look at the UCS Manager interface and, your normal point of entry for all the management in the UCS ecosystem. So first, we'll start with an introduction to UCS Manager, give you kind of an overview of what UCSM, what it needs to run, things like that. Next, logging into UCS Manager, and then the main UCS Manager window. Show the different window panes, some of the kind of the standard options that you have, things that you can do, and then we'll go through each of the major tabs and give you an overview of those tabs in UCS Manager. After that, we will jump into a good lab where I'll kind of walk you through UCSM, show you where to find and pull out information, so you really get a good idea of what we're going to be doing in future lessons. And then finally, there is a command line interface to UCSM. It's something we don't use very often except for really troubleshooting or some other things like that, but I'll give you a demo and some examples of when you would use the CLI. So introduction. Overall management point for the entire UCS environment is UCS Manager or UCSM. It's a web-based system. It's not like a FAT client or anything like that. It's not a Windows executable or anything that you need to install. It is a Java-based web application. It requires Java 1.6 to be installed, so if you don't have Java runtime, you will need to install that first. There's a link on the main UCS Manager page if you don't have it, but most people already have at least some version of Java, but do make sure it's 1.6. No other FAT client to install. You just simply point your browser to the cluster IP that we configure on the interconnects. You'll get the main login window, and from there you can log into the system. One really cool thing about UCS and UCSM is it's all standards based. I mean, we've kind of talked about this in previous lessons, but it's all Ethernet, fiber channel over Ethernet, IP, Java. So there's really no proprietary frameworks within UCS, and that extends to UCSM. Configuration in UCSM is stored in XML. You can export the XML, dump it out, make changes, re-import it, and do all sorts of really neat little things with it for automation. Along with that, there's a very robust API. So what we've seen people do with this is say, you may have UCS at a production site and a DR site, and we'll talk more later about things called service profiles, but they're kind of configurations for what makes your server. So what you can do is dump these things out. They'll dump out into a standard XML format. You can make changes to it and then import those on the DR side. So maybe you've got, an operating system that's running directly on a blade. It's not in VMware, which makes it easy to port, but let's say it's running on, Windows on hardware. You can dump out that service profile, make some changes to the XML, import it to your DR side, and then you've got that kind of containered server imported and ready to boot up. So it gives you a lot of flexibility. And with the robust API, what we're seeing is third-party tools being able to kind of go in and automate and do deployment and provisioning of resources with UCSM very easily without having a lot of cumbersome scripting and things like that. Logging into UCSM is very simple. When you go to the web interface, you'll hit login, launches the Java application, and then you just log in with your credentials. By default, you'll use the admin credentials that we already set, and that's the password we set when we do an initial configuration, which we'll see here in just a minute at the next lesson. But later, you may set up other login credentials for other users or yourself, and you would use those. If you hit a problem here, mainly, you hit the thing to launch UCSM and you're waiting for the login window and it just doesn't appear, or you get an error, 9 times out of 10 is a Java issue. And so you'll need to kind of go and dig into, usually in the Java console, to see where the errors are happening. A lot of times, it's just a simple reinstall of the JRE. Other times, it could be other issues. UCSM works with pretty much any browser and any version of Java I've tried. I will say I've had a few little issues with the new UCSM 2.0 and Java running on Macs because Apple writes the JRE for that, not Sun. I haven't dove into that too much to find a fix, but before that, Safari, Chrome, Firefox, IE, pretty much any browser I threw at it and JRE that I threw at it worked just fine. So, but just a warning, if you have a problem here, it's normally a Java issue. So here's a quick screenshot on the right of the main UCS Manager window. So the overall theme of the window is on the left you have kind of a tree structure, and you'll expand things out, and that structure will differ depending on where you're at in UCSM. I'll show you here, tree structure here, And up here, we have tabs. Depending on your Java platform, this is from a Mac, but if you're Windows, these tabs will look slightly different. They look kind of like buttons for here, but they're different tabs for different things. You know, equipment, SAN, LAN, server. We'll see those in a little bit when we jump in the lab, but when you click on, say, the LAN tab, all the things in the tree will be network related. When you click on something in the tree, the main window to the right will change and give you context sensitive information. And just like on the left, on the right, there may be tabs for different, information depending on where you're at. Some common things that you can do. Most windows will have the alert icons at the top, errors and warnings and information and things like that. You can click on those to instantly jump to a problem. There are plus and minus buttons on the left here, and if there's another tree structure, depending on what you're seeing on the right, they will be the same, and I'll show you this in the demo. But it allows you to quickly expand all items in the tree or close those all back up. There is a filter window right here. Right now that one is set to all, but I could drop that down and say change that to Fabric Interconnects, and it would only show me Fabric Interconnect information. So it allows you to quickly filter out a large tree list into only what you want to see. So I'll tell you right now, the first time people log into UCSM, it can be a little bit overwhelming. You have to remember, this is your portal to everything. Once you understand the tab layouts, once you get an idea of how things are broken up, you can quickly find the information and configurations you're looking for. But it does take a little bit getting used to. That's why we're going to go through the lab here in a little bit. You'll see the same information again probably in later lessons broken up in more detail, but I want you to feel comfortable walking around and looking at UCSM. So the first tab on the left as you log in is Equipment, and it shows all physical components: chassis, interconnects, fabric extenders, rack mount servers should you have them, and subcomponents of each. So there's an example over to the right. Two things you'll see in every one of these tabs are the filter list again, which specifies what you want to see, and colored boxes that denote problems or information. And over here on the right is one from my lab earlier where there were a lot of problems and information. So what we can see here is server 3 is throwing a red box. That's usually bad. That's a failure or a serious problem. Usually it causes an impact. Yellow is a warning. We're seeing specs errors here. There's no rack mount servers. This is actually from the platform emulator, so those will throw warnings. Blue or green or aqua or whatever you want to call it are usually informational warnings. This one here, what you can see is often if it's a subcomponent that's causing it, the main component will have the box as well as the subcomponent. So here we can see that PSU2 or Power Supply 2 has a problem. Odds are it's just missing. So for server 3 here, we could probably expand that out, and it may be an I/O module causing this error. So sometimes it'll be the main component only that has the box, and usually that means it's a kind of system-wide issue, or it may be a subcomponent that you can see if you expand all the boxes out. Pretty much every tree structure will have this: equipment, servers, LAN, SAN. I know those all do it. Admin, there's really nothing for it to flag on, but anything configuration related will show that. Next is the Servers tab, and we haven't really gotten into servers yet. UCS itself has a concept of service profiles and service profile templates, and these are where these are configured, along with a lot of different policies we can see here: adapter, BIOS, boot, scrub, threshold, VNIC, VHBA placement, things like that. A lot of policies that dictate how servers are configured. There's also pool information, which we'll talk about soon in another lesson, scheduling, things like that. So if it's a service profile or server related task or configuration item, normally it's in the Servers tab. Next is LAN. LAN is really all things network. Most of the time what you'll be doing in here is configuring VLAN information. So you'll do VLAN configurations either globally, which means they exist on both fabrics, or per fabric. So you may have a VLAN that only lives on fabric A or fabric B. Uplink and appliance ports, we can look and monitor uplink ports. So if you say I connected port 18 on my interconnect to the core, you'll be able to look at that there. Appliance ports are something we'll talk about later in kind of the storage lesson, but it's really just if you want to direct connect a storage appliance into the interconnect, you would designate an appliance port. Pin groups, if we want to make sure that servers are pinned to certain uplinks, things like that. Network policies, different policies for things mainly around flow control, QoS, thresholds, those sorts of things. And then we have some pools, mainly MAC address pools that again we'll talk about in a later lesson. You can see here there's a lot of information, but if you look at it, it's broken out into very logical components. If I want to look at VLANs, there's a VLAN item. If I want to look at appliances, there's an appliance item. So it's not hard to figure out where you need to go. You just may need to drill down a little bit to get there. Kind of the counterpart to the LAN tab is the SAN tab, all things fiber channel. So if you're using fiber channel, this is where you'll set a lot of your configurations. vSANs, again, we kind of talked about this earlier, but vSANs are the equivalent of VLANs, but on the storage side. Kind of look at it that way. They're global per fabric, and we set our policies and our pools here: worldwide node numbers and port numbers. Once again, filtering out what you don't want to see, as well as the colored boxes to denote information. VM tab. This is an interesting tab. A lot of people don't realize this, but UCSM can talk to VMware environments. There's several reasons for this, and we have a whole lesson on this later, but you can actually see which VMs are running on a blade and push down network configuration and policy from UCSM all the way through vCenter and to the host. So it's really interesting what you can do here. This is where you configure that, monitor it, and look at that information. And finally, the admin tab. The admin tabs is all things administration: faults, events, and audit logs, syslog settings, support information if you want to dump out log files, core dumps, things like that, and administrative settings. So if you want to change the IP of the interconnects, you do it in this tab. If you want to set something like logging to syslog or DNS servers or NTP, it's all done right here. So anything kind of administrative is done right here. Again, you can filter things out. There's really not much of the way of health components, I don't believe, here. I left that node in, but I've never actually seen one of these light up. But it's mainly administration. Also, this is where you would go if you want to do things like radius TACACS authentication, connectivity to Active Directory, or set up other sorts of kind of organizational suborgs or users. Okay, so now it's time to jump into the lab and show you an example of UCS Manager. So in this lab, we will kind of explore UCS Manager, get a good feel for how you move about, what you can do, some of the common functions and features like expanding trees or searching or things like that. Look at the main tabs. We'll walk in through the SAN and LAN and VM and all those and kind of drill down so you can see really what you can pull out of those different tabs. Then kind of note where you find common information and give you a good idea of where to go when you have a question or you need to make a change. So let's go ahead and jump in, and we'll get going in the lab. So here I've remote desktoped into one of my lab environments. What I've got here is UCS Manager 2.0. So all I did was open Firefox and go to my IP address here, which is 10.130.17.5. And when I do that, I get this screen here. If you're on 1.3 or 1.4, it's going to look a little different. Actually, one of the first slides in this lesson, where it was kind of the overview off to the right, that's the older welcome screen. This is the new welcome screen. So a couple of things here. You've got two options. First of all, you can launch UCS Manager, which is what we're going to do, or you can launch the KVM Manager, Keyboard Video Mouse Manager. So if someone needs access to the console of a blade, you can give them access to that without giving them access to UCS Manager. They come here, they launch the KVM Manager, and then they can go and see which blades they have access to. If you don't have JRE 1.6 installed, they give you a link to do that right here. I've already got it installed, so we'll go ahead and launch UCS Manager. In the background, it's going to download a JNLP file. Just have that load with Java. If for some reason it asks you, just say yes. Also, if you get a bunch of questions about certificate warnings, things like that, just accept those and move on. So here's the login screen. Admin. Let's see if I can remember what our password is. And that looks good. So now it'll initialize and it'll load the application. So welcome to UCS Manager. As I said, we've got a few things here. So let's look at the main topology view. Over on the left are my tabs: Equipment, Servers, LAN, SAN, VM, and Admin. On the right, I've got kind of my main context window. A few common things. I talked about some of the warnings and alert status here. So you've got critical, major, minor, and warnings kind of information. Over here, we've got things like I can do new service profiles, VLANs, vSANs. So if you want to quickly create something, you can do that right there. Kind of quickly jump me to the pointer, because those are common things that people will do. Once UCS is up and running, these are kind of your common tasks. Service profiles, organizations, if you do suborgs, VLANs, vSANs, and users. We've got options here, which allow you to set kind of some overall options like confirm delete, confirm discard changes, confirm modifications, things like that. External applications, you can, if you want to SSH in and give it parameters, say maybe use PuTTY, you can point it to that. Session information, do you want it to automatically reconnect to your previous session? I said yes, which is kind of why it dropped me into a different tab. Do you want it to time out, logging levels, things like that. And visual enhancements, so some of these history sizes, right align, wizard transition effects. If you're remoting in a lot, you may want to turn some of this stuff off, but I'll leave that for default for now. Questions, you can always go here. Neat thing is you can hit this. I just did help on help, but let's say I wanted to do help on chassis. It's going to go in and pull up information on the main topology view. So it's not real exciting here. I'll show you some examples of that later where it actually does help. So if you get a weird, you're filling out a service profile and there's a question that you just don't understand, you're like, I don't know what you're asking me. Hit that, hit the pointer on the question, and it'll pull up the help about that question. So you're not digging through help trying to search and find what you need. Information, just going to tell me what version I am, UCS M201Q. And exit if I want to exit. Pending activities, if I have some things running, kind of tasks running, I'll be able to click that and see it. I don't have anything running, so that's not really exciting right now, but it'll light up and you'll be able to click that. So these things are common across all your windows that you'll see. So let's start here on the equipment tab. So up here, I mentioned this earlier, plus and minus, expand and collapse. So I'll expand all again, and you can just kind of keep going and going and going. You usually want to stop somewhere in the middle. Of course, it doesn't let me really retract all of it, but good enough. So what we've got here on the left is all of my equipment. Again, if I want to see something, just say the chassis, I can hit the filter list, and it's only going to show me chassis information. So if I have a lot of things, maybe I have 20 chassis, can't really do that yet. I think the limit's 14, but one day it will be 20. When I do 20, I may not want to have all 20 chassis and interconnects and everything. I just want to filter out. For now, we'll say all. So the main screen up here, we click equipment, and the first thing we normally see is the main topology view. Just to let you know, I do have some warnings here, or as we call them, major faults. That's because of power. This is a lab. You know how it is in labs. You never have enough power. So I've only got one power supply in the chassis and one connected to each of the interconnects. So it's complaining about power supply issues. How would I know that? Well, I could click this. It's going to take me over here. And all these are going to be power, 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 and PSU insufficient. So you can always quickly hit these and see what my minor faults and major faults and things like that are. Let's go back to equipment. Topology view. So this lab is very simple. It is two interconnects. If you remember from your components lesson, you might be able to tell me which interconnects these are by looking at them. These are 6248 UPs, the Unified Port Model. We have these in the lab, testing them out with the modules in them, and a single chassis with a couple of blades. So on the equipment side, I can do things like looking at the interconnects. Interconnect A is primary, the second one, B, is subordinate. Remember, that is for management only. They're both passing data. I can pull things down here, like fixed modules and expansion modules. And we haven't talked about how you configure ports on these yet, but bottom line is you kind of designate their functionality. Server ports are things that go to a chassis. Makes it really easy. I can highlight those, and I can see that port 1 on Fabric Day goes to the chassis. It's up and it's enabled, so 1, 2, 3, 4. On the expansion module, uplink fiber channel ports and uplink Ethernet ports. So this goes to our core network in the lab. and these guys go to uplink fiber channel. We've only got one actively running right now. So you can quickly kind of dive in and see what your fabric interconnects are doing. Servers, I've only got 2 blades in here right now, but it gives you the number of servers, the cores, how many are enabled. You know, if you have licensing, you may restrict cores, HBAs, NICs, things like that. Policies, there's always faults view. Again, that's kind of what's happening and what's been cleared. Some of the standard policies that we'll do, some of these we will set in later lessons. Firmware management, we will also talk about this in detail in a later lesson, but the cool thing about UCS is that I can come in here and quickly and easily update firmwares across the board, across my environment from an interface such as this. And one thing to note, there's a startup version, a running version, and a backup version. So when we update firmwares, you'll be able to see this here and note which versions you're running on which thing. If something fails on 201Q, I can roll back to 143I. Nice little fail-safe thing. Thermal just shows kind of your heating efficiencies. Expand these out. Bottom line is everybody's good, fans are happy. And decommissioned is just decommissioned information. I don't have anything that's decommissioned. From here, we can drill down. So I can drill down to specific chassis or overall chassis, and I can pull down into a full chassis here. This is what is known as the hybrid view. This is a good view because if you remember from the components lesson, I kind of drew out that logical diagram there at the end. And this is kind of gives you the same thing. So you can see here that this blade has 2 I/O ports coming out of it. This goes to one FEX. Remember, this is in the back of the chassis. This calls them I/O modules here. I told you the naming can get confusing. And the other port goes to the other FEX. Well, then this FEX has 4 connections that go to interconnect A, and this one has 4 that goes to B. So you can literally see that fabric port 24 here goes up to Ethernet port, I believe that is port 14. But you can see that it actually draws the lines, and this is correct, physically correct, meaning whatever lines these things connect are actually what's plugged in to the back of the FEXs to the interconnects. It's a quick and dirty way to see how many ports are connected and how your servers are lining up. Jump back to general on the chassis and we get a front view of the chassis. Excuse my kind of low resolution here. You'll find that higher resolution is better for UCSM. But what we get is a physical front view of the chassis. So it's complaining to the left about redundancy failed. So most components you'll have a kind of a status area here, fault summary here, some actions that you can do, and then other information. You'll see this when we look at blades, when we look at interconnects, when we look at everything. It says redundancy failed. Well, if we look here, there's only one power supply installed, so that's not very redundant, which explains the error message. We have 2 blades here. Those appear to be B200s, and we could actually click on these or double click on these, and it will jump us down to the appropriate blade section or subcomponent. So it's very easy to drill down. And really the rest of the information on the chassis is pretty simple. It'll show you what blades are in it. We talked about a little bit about service profiles, but you can see which service profiles are active in a chassis. We have a whole lesson on those. The I/O modules, these are 2104 XPs, so if you remember that. And the neat thing here is it will show you kind of front ports and back ports. If you remember, we talked about kind of back-facing server ports that go to blades. That's my backplane ports. I've only got 2 blades in this chassis, so only 2 ports are going to come up. If I had 8, I'd see 8 ports. Fabric ports, these are ports that go up to the interconnects. All 4 of these are plugged in, so we see them up and functional. Same thing for FEX number 2. Status on my fans, status on my power supplies. We saw the hybrid display. Slots, these are basically just blade slots, you know, showing state and how everything is. Maybe you popped in a blade and it's just not showing up. We can see if the slot is active. Firmware tab again. And moving across the top, we have things like power. It will give you an estimated power usage. The keyword is estimated. So don't take this as gospel that that's what it's using. Temperature from the sensors inside the chassis. We'll give you temperature in Celsius. You can convert that if you'd like. Any statistics, so if you want to know statistics on, current voltage, high voltage, things like that, all that is in here. Environmental counter, there's just temperature on the memory stick, so you can really dig into some of this. FSM. FSM is something I don't think we've mentioned yet. It sounds really impressive. Finite state machine. Finite state machine. You're going to see this, the FSM, in a number of places throughout UCS. If you just noticed, it just ran an update all of a sudden. Basically, it sounds impressive, but it's really not. What FSM does is, if I kick off a task, re-acknowledging a chassis, which means I want to rescan the network configuration of a chassis, it will kick off a task, and you can come into FSM and see what it's doing. If I reboot a server blade, and it can take a while to reboot one of the servers on here, especially when it is applying a service profile, and you're like, man, this is, it's taking a couple minutes. I wonder what it's doing. You can go into the FSM of that blade, and it will give you a progress state and status, and if there's an error code and anything like that. So it's just kind of a what's going on with that component. Every so often it'll kind of rescan something or look at that, and you may see that show up in the FSM. So again, finite state machine, it's where you go to see if something's happening on a component. Events, just any event codes. Oops. Faults, we're going to see faults, so things like this. Log management. Capacity, we're going to see power states on here because of only one power supply. Connectivity policy, nothing here. Power control, you can actually do things like putting power budgets on blades and chassis and capping them. So if you are under, you can't sustain all your blades at 100% and you run out of power before and start, popping breakers, you can actually put caps on chassis and caps on blades and kind of keep things in containment. This is this is one of those things that's getting better and better. It's an evolving feature set. I don't know anyone that's actually using this yet, but you do have the capability to do that, and it'll show you this information. And just some standard, logging here. See if it can pull anything up. There you go. Kind of CIMC logging information, any sorts of errors, anything like that. Really, most of the time on a chassis, you're not going to do a whole lot. You may look at I/O modules, you may look at hybrid display, you may look at firmware, possibly look at some of your temperatures for making sure your fans are good. But usually you come to the main screen, you make sure everybody's green. If you change network configurations, you may acknowledge the chassis. That'll kind of re-blip and reconfigure the chassis. So if you add more cables, you may want to re-acknowledge the chassis, or if support ever says to do that, you can do that. There's also a locator LED. You have these on chassis and blades. I can turn that on, and if anybody's standing in my lab, they're probably wondering why there's a blue light on the chassis now. But we can then turn it back off. There we go. Oops, I think I did that backwards. It actually shows it here that it's on. There we go. I think I'm doing it too fast. I'll give it a minute this time. I'm impatient. There it goes. Now it just turned off. Okay. Just goes to show you that impatience isn't always a good thing. Down here on the left, we can see other things such as fans, and really it's going to take us through the tabs that we've already seen. Servers, fans, things like that. Rack mounts, if you have C-Series rack mount servers within your B-Series environment, you will see FEXs and servers here. I don't have any of that in my lab, so none of these are populated. If for some reason you do, you'll see population there. Below chassis are the interconnects. We've kind of seen some of this already with kind of our port settings, but what I'd like to see here is you can look at I/O modules connected to the interconnects. That's kind of nice. So from the interconnect view, you can look down at the FEXs that it sees. And we have thermal, power, specific fans, installed firmware, and it'll tell you which version of UCSM is installed, which is sometimes handy. And any faults. and also performance. So let's expand this guy. Kind of gives you UCS ESX1 is one of our blades, so we can see throughput, HBAs, NICs, all sorts of information for throughput here. That's physical. I'm sorry, that's logical. If we take a look at physical, we can continue seeing some of this stuff here as far as port information. So if you want to know, hey, what's port 3 on my interconnect doing, this is where you can look at it. Now, this isn't very exciting, right? I don't want to look at this. You can monitor it with things like SNMP. SolarWinds Orion toolset will also directly monitor UCS and monitor the FEXs, the interconnects, things like that. It's a very powerful toolset. So if you're a SolarWinds Orion shop, I recommend that you take a look at using that for this. So let's see. We can drill down to a specific interconnect. Go back to the General tab again, and you get that kind of front view of the interconnect. If something is red or green, you can kind of look at it and tell you what it is. So if I highlight this, it says Ethernet port 13, type is server. Server ports go down to chassis. This is 2.1 and it's network. That's going up to the core network. And 2.16, is that also network? Yes, that is also network. So you can see exactly what your links are doing. Trying to see if any of them are listed as storage. Some things that you can do here that we'll talk about in a little bit are like configuring ports. There's different managers like LAN Uplinks Manager. And really what it allows you to do is go through and look at things like port channels, VLANs, server links, quality of service items. It's just kind of a one-stop shop for network configuration. If you remember, at one point I talked about you have two modes for the interconnects. We talked about that under architecture, kind of the end host mode and switching mode. You can set that here. If you hit this, it's going to reboot the interconnects. It will warn you first, but it'll reboot interconnects. But it's kind of a one-stop shop for LAN uplinks. We have one for SAN, storage manager if you're in storage switching mode. You can enable all ports, disable all ports. So just kind of drill down into information here. And through the top, you have your other tabs, your standard tabs, your physical ports, fans, power supplies, physical displays, FSM if you're doing something, false events and statistics. And while I'm in here, let me look at uplink fiber channel ports. Yeah, see, I thought 216 was. So that's an interesting little issue. 216 type network. That should be type storage or storage uplink. Interesting. Wonder if that's a bug in this version of UCSM. Anyway, moving on. That's pretty much everything you see on the interconnects. Both of them will be the same. We have a primary, and we have the secondary. You see things also here like startup versions, kernel versions, bootloaders, all that. Just making sure there's nothing else here. Turn on locator LED so you know which one is which. I won't take you through that song and dance again. But really just normal stuff. So that's everything on the equipment tab. Moving on to servers, we have kind of the same thing. So a few things here. Servers are normally with UCS. We don't really talk about running software on a blade. We talk about a service profile. We'll get into service profiles in depth in a later lesson. But really, if you're a virtualization person, service profiles due to hardware what we've been doing with VM. So on VMware, you have what's known as a VMX file. It's a config file that kind of says, hey, this VM is 2 processors and 8 gigs of RAM, and these are what the disks are, and this is what the network looks like. That's a service profile. So on a blade, we have MAC addresses, worldwide node and port names, numbers, UUIDs, which are kind of like serial numbers, firmware versions, firmware settings, all that stuff on a physical blade, just like a physical server. But that causes issues if we want to move a workload from one blade to another. So we don't normally use those hardware settings. We absolutely can, we just normally don't. we do a service profile, which says, okay, I'm going to use just kind of a logical MAC address and a logical UUID and a logical WWN, WWPN, and I'm going to know what version of firmwares and what settings that you want for this server, and we kind of package that up. So when we push out a service profile to a blade, all that stuff kind of overlays the hardware. So the MAC address is what's in the service profile. It's not what's burned into the chip on the blade. So it allows you flexibility. We can make quick and easy changes. And when, say, a B200M3 comes out, I can apply a service profile on it, even if it's using different chipsets and things underneath. So it gives us this flexibility and mobility. So that's basically what the servers tab is. It is service profile management. So I'm not going to walk through detail by detail like I did on equipment, because we're going to do this in a later lesson. But I just want you to know that's what you do on the servers tab. So you have templates. We'll create a service profile template, like one that's for VMware servers or Windows 2008 servers. That way, when I want to bring up a new Windows 2008 blade, I just kind of generate one off the template, and I know they're all the same. So I don't have to run through the wizards every time I want to do it. There's also a lot of policies here. These policies dictate how service profiles function. Boot policies. What do I want to boot from? I may have a boot from SAN policy and a boot from local policy. And for VMware, I may say I want you to use the boot from SAN policy. But for Windows templates, I want you to do boot from local policy. So you get to decide what you want to do. Maintenance policies, scrub policies. When I, pull or disassociate a service profile from a physical blade, I may want it to kind of clean disk off so the next install looks like it's on fresh disk. So you set these policies up ahead of time, and then when I create a service profile, I refer back to them so I don't have to do configurations every single time. It can get a little bit confusing, but when you start looking at it like that, it makes more sense. So I'm not going to go through all these 100 tabs up here. We'll do that later. One other thing, you see everything here has root on top of it. We can do organizations and sub-organizations within UCSM. So you may have, people always say, like, okay, you got an accounting department and development and IT. I'm probably not going to give accounting access to UCSM, but I may have different organizations of IT or development that I want to split out resources for and give rights to those organizations and not give rights to others. So that's how you can kind of do a hierarchical organization and access control with UCSM. By default, everything is under root. We'll go into this also in more depth in a later lesson, but that's why you see root on top of everything. Next is the LAN tab, and we're going to get real detailed on this really quick here, because this is one of the first things we do on a configuration, but it's all about my network connectivity. So Fabric A, Fabric B, port channels, uplink interfaces to the core, and VLANs. So VLANs, virtual networks, you can create these in 3 places. I can have VLANs that exist only on Fabric A, only on Fabric B, or 99% of the time they exist on both, which is what we see here in the lab. So VLAN 7 can be reached via Fabric A or Fabric B. You normally want to do this because what if Fabric A fails? Do I really want a VLAN I can only get through A? Probably not. Appliance ports, these are normally considered storage things, but we normally we connect NAS type storage to them, NFS, iSCSI, so they're really network ports, but we set those there. We also have policies here, just kind of threshold policies and some other kind of dynamic configuration policies, and we'll talk about those more in detail. But that's really it as far as what you need to worry about now. Here, things like VLANs, server links, MAC assignments. So we'll talk about how, I mentioned a minute ago that MAC addresses kind of exist in a service profile. We create pools for that, and you can kind of look and say, okay, out of that pool, he assigned MAC address 25B511AA0D to whatever. Let's see if we have one in here. Yep, there we go. So as you can see, it doesn't assign these like starting at the top and working itself down. Kind of an annoying thing because it's not always easy to map up how you're going to be deploying out MAC addresses or other things, but here we are. So MAC address 0025B511AA8F is assigned to UCS ESX1 VMNIC 0 Management A. That's just a name we made up. That's a NIC that exists on that service profile for that blade, but that's how we can match those. IPs, we can do things like when we set up KVM access, we throw UCSM a range of IPs and say allocate these IPs as you see fit for KVM access. And here we can see how those match up. So 10.130.17.106 is assigned to blade 2. 10.130.17.107 is assigned to blade 1. Just as a quick FYI, and I'll talk about this more in a later lesson when we do pulls, is that these are actually reached through the management interfaces on the interconnects. So when you plug in ports into the front, into the management 0 interfaces on the interconnects, these are how those IPs are reached. So when you ping 10.130.17.106, the physical interface is actually management 0 on one of the interconnects. You don't know which interconnect. That's what I have found in lab and in production, is that I have seen issues with one of the management 0 interfaces. All of a sudden, half of the KVM access goes down. Go and look, and it turned out we had a bad port or bad cable going to one of those interconnects. So you just want to kind of keep that in mind, that those are reached through that, which means they also need to be kind of on that same network as management 0 for the interconnects. QoS, we can set global QoS policies here. We've done that in our lab. We'll talk about this a little bit more later. Policies, faults, and events, and again, finite state machine. So that's pretty much everything there. Next is SAN. SAN is just like LAN, really. Instead of VLANs, we have vSANs. They can exist on Fabric A, Fabric B, or global. We have policies like threshold policies, fiber channel adapter policies, VHBA templates. And for pools here, instead of MAC address pools, we have WWNN, WWPN pools, and we can do traffic monitoring. Just like with MAC addresses, we can look at fiber channel identity assignments and the pool assignments, and we'll talk about those in the storage lesson. In the VM tab, it's all things virtual machines. This is VMware specific, not plugging into any other hypervisor right now. But we can pull in our clusters, we can pull in our vCenters, our virtual machines like we've got here in the lab. The nice thing is we can use a technology that we'll talk about later called VMFX. If you use the distributed virtual switch with VMware, we can actually create interfaces here that get pushed down to VMs and port groups that get pushed down to the vSphere host, and it's all managed from UCSM. Then we can do interesting things like better flow and rate control and QoS and stuff like that from UCSM than we even can through the distributed switch. So this is something that some people use. I see it as an underutilized feature, kind of misunderstood. I was going to say understood, but kind of misunderstood. So we'll show some demos of that in a later lesson. Here you can see things like VMs. So server 1, 2 has these VMs. So if you want to know what VMs are running on blade 8, you'll be able to come in here and see that. Switches, switch configurations, these are virtual switches on the VM side. Certificates, if you want to import certificates in from, say, vCenter. Lifecycle, kind of VM retention, VNIC retention, how long things live. Events, and of course, finite state machine. Finally, admin tab. Admin tab is all things administration. So you notice the filter is already set to faults, events, and audit. That's because we double-clicked on one of these guys earlier, and it jumps you over here and changes the filter. There's a lot of stuff here. So if I do all, you see a lot of things. So the first things that you're probably more interested in are, this is where you can tell the IP address of Fabric A and Fabric B and see the cluster IP as well as the name. So my name here is GSO UCS Lab, Greensboro UCS Lab. Interconnect here is going to be GSO UCS Lab -A and -B. On the left, we can actually, one real quick thing here again on the right, if you click Management Interfaces, this is where you can re-IP address your re-IP your interconnect. So if you do want to change one, this is where you do it. Be careful, make sure it's right, all that stuff. You're going to be hooking up a console cable and redoing it. But if you want to re-IP it, this is where it's done. You can do things like here, like polling, interface monitoring, kind of retry intervals, how you want to do it, pinging, ARPing. things like that, we've got it set for disabled right now. Being in a lab, we plug and unplug things all the time. I don't want my cluster freaking out when we unplug something. Back to the left, faults, events, and audit log. We saw a little bit of that earlier, but you can kind of see your events, your faults, your settings. Syslog. If you want to set syslog, here's where you set it. So you can kind of set up monitoring to files or monitoring to syslog servers, and you give it the address and the facility and things like that. So if you want to do syslog, you do it there. Core files, if something has happened and the process has crashed and left a core dump file, you'll see it here. Tech support files, we hit plus to the right. I can create and download a tech support file. So if you're on the phone with Cisco TAC and they want you to do that, you can do that and create that here. And settings, just kind of a few things here. Flapping policy, if something keeps happening every 3 seconds, it will be considered to be flapping. So, if you have a NIC or a port that goes up and down, up and down, up and down, it'll cause a flapping issue. You'll get overloaded with events. So what we often do is we will up this interval so that it kind of gets rid of some of that. Maybe set that for, you want it to wait 30 seconds, and we'll clear out some of the events, things like that. User manager, we'll talk about this later in the access lesson, but you can set what kind of authentication, LDAP, radius, TACACS, integration with Active Directory that you want here. Key management if you do SSL keys or certificates. Communication, you can set up call home functionality. So we go here, and you can actually set it so that if something bad happens, say a DIMM fails in a blade, it will call home to Cisco and it will tell them that, hey, we lost something. We, go ahead and open a ticket and you'll get a call from Cisco about the failed item. So you can kind of set some of the policies. You can work with TAC for getting this correct for your configuration. DNS, just add DNS servers here. I guess we're using the Google DNS servers, but just hit plus and specify a new one. You specify these in initial configuration, but you come here if you want to change those. Management pools, this is where we will set up the KVM management. And here's where you create a block of IP addresses. And you can see where they're assigned. And just kind of looking at it from a block or from a specific IP address configuration. We'll talk about that in the pools lesson. Again, IP addresses here. We saw that earlier. And some stats management down at the bottom. Actually, there's a lot other stuff here. Fabric configurations, policy settings, threshold policies. Some of these we saw in LAN and SAN tabs. Time zone management. Make sure your time zone is correct for your environment. And here's where we set NTP. If you want to set an NTP server, you come here and do that. And what we call capability catalog is just things about what we're capable of using. So I don't really get a lot of use out of this tab, but oops. It's basically saying, what do we support? B230s, B440s. That's basically comes out of firmware configuration information. So really, the only option here is if you get a new piece of hardware and you want to know if it's supported by your version of UCSM, you can look here, but it's easier to look on the compatibility matrix than it is to look there. So that's pretty much a walkthrough of UCSM. I think you'll find that it's very easy to use. Just kind of look at how it's laid out. Feel free, to look at the platform emulator and kind of walk through all the configuration. That way you can do it without worrying about, changing anything on the production side. So that concludes this lab. We'll jump back over to the slide deck. UCS Manager also has a command line interface. So, not really an alternative to the graphical user interface. We really only use this for things like debugging and troubleshooting. Not everything can be done through the CLI. So if you're a Cisco guy, kind of like I am, I'm used to being able to SSH into a device using NXOS or iOS command line to do everything. I kind of shy away from some of the graphical tools for managing those devices, but UCS is not like that. Everything you do for normal administration and configuration needs to be done through UCSM GUI. But sometimes you need to drill down and really pull out some information, or you're having a problem, or maybe Cisco TAC is going to ask you to kind of go into this interface. So I want you to be familiar with it, understand what it's for, and kind of get used to the command structure. It is not NXOS really. You can get to that level, and I'll show you, but for the most part, it's unlike any other system that you've probably used. There are ways to interact with the underlying NXOS on the interconnects. I'll show you that. And you normally drill down to components by using the scope command. So let's take a look here. In this lab, we're going to do a couple of things. We'll show you the UCSM CLI, and then some of the common commands: help, show, scope, top and up, where, and connect. So let's jump on over and we'll get that started. So to do this, we will launch PuTTY. And you can SSH into either one of the specific interconnects or the cluster IP, and the cluster IP address will just take you into whichever one is primary, which is probably going to be, yep, it's still A for me. So we'll say OK. I'm going to log in as an admin using the same password we have set before. And here we are in the NXOS system. So let me resize the window a little bit in case we need that. I'm a big fan of using PuTTY for several reasons. It's a great tool, free, very small, and very efficient. So first thing I want to do is question mark. So question mark just kind of is the quick and dirty help. Kind of shows you what some of your things are. Acknowledge, backup, clear an object, commit transaction buffer, so you can make a lot of changes and then use the commit command to apply those. Connect, we'll show you that for connecting to other command line interfaces like local management in XOS. Decommission objects, discards. End, if you're used to kind of some of the iOS nature, you can end to go back to exec mode. Exit, remove. Scope is one that we'll use a lot here. You can set an item by using the set command, fairly obvious. We'll show you the show command, terminal, top and up. Go to the top mode, go up one mode. Those will make sense when we start scoping things out. And where will show information about where you're at currently, kind of like right now I'm at the root. So let's walk through some of these and we'll see. First, let's do the show command. If you're familiar again with any of the other Cisco command line stuff, this one is fairly familiar. So we can do things like show and hit enter or question mark, and it will show, what my options are. So there's a lot of things here. So show chassis. Chassis 1, overall status, problem, power problem, acknowledge. So we knew that from UCSM. But maybe we want to look at something like inventory detail. So it's UCS 5108, which is a SKU. There's your numbers, your vendor information, your models, and your serial number. So it gives you a little bit of information. So how about show fabric? And if you type a partial command like FAB and hit tab, it'll complete. If you don't type enough, such as F, it'll do it. It'll just kind of give you what your options are. FAB, inventory detail. So this gives you information about your fabric interconnects. There are 6248 unified ports, serial numbers, out of band IP addresses. That's what OOB, out of band. These are your kind of your .6 is your specific IP for that guy, .7 there. And it gives you information such as memory. Some other things that we can look at on Fabric Interconnect are mode. So right now he is in end host mode for Ethernet switching and end host mode for fiber channel switching. Those will make more sense in the next couple lessons, but if you want to quickly look at that. Or version. What version of UCSM am I running? Well, I'm running 201Q. So it's just a quick way to kind of walk around and kind of look at things like that. What else? Let's see. Oh, show question mark. Let's do show configuration. So here is a dump of the configuration as it exists on the interconnects. So I'm going to hit space. And notice all of this stuff is set by the set command. So I showed you that you set parameters by that. It's very similar to that. Kind of reminds me of the old CAT OS on old Catalyst switches. But it kind of, it enters BIOS policies, it enters all these other policies, and basically walks through and sets all the things that you see in UCSM. So me being a really big command line guy, I still don't want to do this. I would still rather use UCSM than try to figure all this out. So that's why I say you don't normally do things in here. So we will space, 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 and it is a ton of stuff. You can hit Q at any time to exit out. And I think that's what I'll do. Q. So there we are. Basically shows you everything that you want to pull down. Next, let's take a look at the scope command. Scope question. Scope lets you kind of zoom down and work with a specific item. So I may want to scope to a mezzanine adapter, a chassis, a server, a fabric interconnect. There's all sorts of things that you can scope into. So we'll try, let's see, for example, we will scope chassis. Let's see if I just say scope chassis. Obviously I can't type today. I don't know why it's doing that. Scope chassis 1 through 255. I don't have 255 chassis. I'm going to do number 1. So now you see where we have kind of walked down on the kind of prompt to chassis 1. If I do where, it's going to say, hey, you're scoped down to chassis 1. So if you ever can't remember where you're at, just type where. He'll tell you where you're at. Then we can do things like scope, question mark, and now we can go further into the chassis. So let's do scope IO module. 1 or 2, A or B. We'll do A. And so here we can do things like acknowledge it, activate it with a new image version. So if you dump down a new image, we can type activate. We can show information, so show version. It's going to tell you that we're running 201Q, what the status is. Show FSM if you want to see finite state machine. Status. Shows you what the status is or if it's working on a task. Really can do about anything. And here we can scope to a port group. So if we've set up port groups on the I/O module, we'll be able to scope down even further. Again, I type where, and it'll tell me where it's at. Good example of use of the up command. Let's say I want to move back up to the chassis from the I/O module. I just type up, say where. And then let's say I want to scope down to server. We only have 2, so let me do server 1 and scope down to the CPU. Sorry, you don't know which one. Here we can do all sorts of crazy things. Detail. So here's your CPU, your stepping, your product names, your thermal situation. Show stats. All sorts of statistics. So you can pull a lot of stuff out of here. That was actually at a troubleshooting session at Cisco Live, I think it was last year, where we were going really deep into, you know, the chips and components on some of these pieces and pulling things out that I'm just like, I would never want to know this information, and I'd really hate to be in a position where I'm on the call with support or we're looking at stuff at that low level. But I think it kind of shows where Cisco has come from and some of their other, other products and technologies that you may not want to be able to get deep enough into this stuff to pull this out, but it's going to be really nice one day should you ever have to. So it just shows you kind of the power and flexibility you get. Again, talking about top and up, let's say I'm done with chassis. I just type top and it takes me all the way back out. So I don't have to type up, 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 up or anything like that. I just type top and bing, I'm right back where I started. So pretty neat there. Next, connect. So connect allows you to kind of migrate to different components into different CLIs. So connect question. We can connect to CIMC, Cisco Integrated Management Controller, which is kind of the onboard management controllers. Connect to IO modules. Connect to local management. We'll talk about that. As well as connect to NX OS, which is the underlying Nexus operating system on the interconnect. So let's do local management. So connect local management. So I can connect to the local management on Fabric A or Fabric B. So now I am on Fabric B. So I can go, I can do show version. It's going to show me stuff about Fabric B. So it allows you to do things and connect and do other commands. So you can also do things like, let's see, cluster. Cluster, so I can force local fabric interconnect to become primary. So now I jump to B, and I can say cluster force, and it will force this guy to take over, and then we'll switch the cluster mode. So that's an option if you want to manually do that. I can also do reboots, where I do a reboot, and it'll reboot this guy. So there's reasons for using local management. Exit, and we fall back to where we were before. And finally, the last thing I really want to show you is connect NXOS. And now on Fabric A, I am on the underlying NXOS. So if I do a show version, we will see that this is version 503N2 of NXOS. So NXOS is Nexus operating system. It's what runs on Nexus, say, 5000s, 5500s, and 7000 Cisco switches. It's also running on your interconnects. The 6248s are somewhat of a Nexus 5548. The old 6120, 6140s were somewhat a Nexus 5010 and a 5020. So you have the option to kind of dig in here and do all sorts of stuff. So I can show running config, and you will see the running config of NXOS. This is something you rarely ever need to worry about, because what's going to happen is things from the up-level UCSM are going to push down any NXOS changes that need to be done. So at this point, you're kind of in a realm where you really want to do things with, Cisco TAC. Anything you do here could greatly adversely affect the rest of the environment. So be careful. But the only really cool thing in here that you may want to do is ETH Analyzer. You can actually do a packet analyzer with this guy. So you can do start local captures. I believe that it's just kind of an integrated version of Wireshark. It's the same on the Nexus switches as well. But it's kind of something interesting to look at should you need to pull out low-level packet capture debugs. That's pretty much it for the walkthrough on the CLI. So only use it when you need to. You can use it to do some very low-level things. You can also use it to capture information that you can't get out of UCSM and get to the underlying NXOS. So that's it for this lesson. Kind of interesting lesson. It's a good walkthrough of the UCS Manager GUI and the command line interface. So we started off with Introduction to UCS Manager. What is UCS Manager? What do you need to run it? Is it a thin app or a thick app? We saw that it's a Java-based application and that you need JRE version 1.6. But the good news is it works about any different browser. So even being a Mac user, I can use Chrome or Safari and manage a UCS environment just as good as a Windows guy can. Showed you how to log into UCS Manager. By default, we use the admin login, but as you start deploying or actually provisioning new users, you may want to use another login other than that. But I showed you how to get to the UCS Manager interface, showed you that you can log into UCSM or actually log into a KVM interface, and you have the options there. Next was the main UCS Manager window. Trees on the left for different hierarchical components, main window on the right. We talked about how to get help, how to use some of the other functions, expanding trees, collapsing trees, information, being able to set things like transitions on the wizards and confirmations and all that. Went through a kind of an overview of all the manager tabs. So we did, equipment, LAN, SAN, VM, admin, talked about what they all did and what their purpose was. And finally, UCS Manager command line interface. So we showed the CLI, that the tool that you don't really want to use unless you have to, but it's absolutely there and extremely powerful. So the whole idea of this lesson was to get you comfortable within UCSM and comfortable a little bit with the CLI. If you want some more time with the UCSM outside of a production environment, absolutely use the UCS platform emulator that we talked about in one of the early lessons on labs and lab configuration. Go through there and get comfortable, because as we move forward in these next lessons, we're going to be in UCS Manager a lot. We're going to be moving around a lot. So it's good to kind of know where things are at. That way you can move quickly and efficiently and get ready to start doing the full configuration. So that's it for this lesson. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you on the next one.